Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast. I'm joined again by Right Ruminations. We are going to talk about the Tory and Whig political parties, philosophies, and their influence, and our thoughts on their philosophies in the English historical accounts. So, Right Ruminations, why don't you introduce us to the Tories and the Whigs, where they come from, what they stand for, and how they've evolved over time?
Well, in a popular or colloquial terminology in English politics and history, Whig, generally speaking, means something like classical liberal or liberal in general, and Tory means something broadly speaking like classical conservative or just conservative. Now, the term Tory has stuck with us because it's still used to refer to the actual Conservative Party, whereas the term Whig has gone by the wayside in terms of politics. They're terms that emerged from around, I think, just before the Glorious Revolution, as a kind of development of the earlier struggle in the English Civil War between the parliamentary side and the royalist side. And so English politics in the early modern period was very much focused on the struggle between parliamentary supremacy and royal supremacy. And basically, the Whigs were on the side of Parliament, generally speaking, and the Tories were on the side of the monarch. And I think that generally speaking, we would associate the Whigs with sort of almost proto-libertarian impulses or classical liberal impulses, like supporting privatization of the commons through something that were called enclosure laws at the time, supporting religious liberty, more so at least for Protestant subjects, and are kind of the basic impulse in society after which a lot of John Locke's ideas were modeled. Whereas the Tories were people who basically were the party of the stewards, the steward line, which was the line that was replaced in the Glorious Revolution. From there on, they went through a number of evolutions. By the time you come to the American Revolution, and hopefully later on we can talk about the role of Tories and Whigs in the American Revolution, because that's often an ill-understood issue. But by that point, they basically supported parliamentary sovereignty, which is that the Parliament can do as it pleases as long as it has the King's stamp of approval. And basically, the King's stamp of approval is taken as a given. He doesn't really, in practice, have an option, except formally speaking. Whereas Tories, I think for a long time came out of favor in English politics, and they sort of became like the party of nostalgia, associated with people like Samuel Johnson, and sort of paved the way for like G.K. Chesterton. And so they were kind of like these people who wanted the Stuarts back, and were against the English system of parliamentary sovereignty, which is what we have now. They went through a further change in the 19th century, where the Tories became something more populist, you might say, under Benjamin Disraeli, like supported expanding the franchise. But there was also this kind of idea of like caring for the poor and sort of reviving noblesse oblige, whereas in the late 19th century, the Whigs, who then became the Liberals, they were more associated with what was called Manchester liberalism, which was like Herbert Spencer, Richard Cobden, kind of like the Ebenezer Scrooge image of like of indulgent individualism or crass individualism. But then with John Stuart Mill, the Liberal Party eventually came to adopt welfare state socialism in his later years, and then the Conservatives would eventually take up the mantle of laissez-faire capitalism and classical liberalism, where you'd end up with this binary liberal versus conservatives, with the conservatives supporting more the Whig philosophy, and I guess the liberals supporting something more like the welfare state, or what we'd consider more part and parcel with the modern left. So that's a basic outline of the kind of historical trends of Whiggism and Toryism.
So would it be fair to say that generally Whigs supported tradition, or I think it was what Chesterton called the permanent things, and the Whigs tended to elevate human reason as a means to solve problems?
Whigs supported this idea of kind of innovation in the British structure of government, which cannot be understood apart from the politics of the Enlightenment, right? That they were with capitalism, they were with, but also with the welfare state in a funny kind of way. And they were also with the rise of the Church of England, you might say a certain vision of the Church of England. Obviously, the Church of England predates them, but the political development of it, like the Protestant succession, for example. And so this idea, almost like teleological idea of a British destiny that's advancing towards kind of independent liberal vision, away from this sort of more, you might say, romantic paternalism that is very much of a kind of permanent things, Chestertonian, Burkean tone.
Yeah, all I have to say, well, starting off, I think as far as restoring the Stuarts, the Tories had bad taste. If you wanted a Catholic monarchy, then restore the Plantagenets. But I think arguably the Tudors were the most effective English monarchy. Now, initially they were Catholic, Henry VII, but of course the Tudors kind of leave a bad taste in a lot of reactionaries' mouths because of Henry VIII. But I think that one of the things that arguably could have been a weakness of the Tory position is because they were associated with the Stuarts, and the Stuarts were associated with Catholicism. Charles I was seen as a crypto-Catholic. James II was a Catholic. That probably left them somewhat disadvantaged, I would imagine. Is that a correct assessment?
It left them disadvantaged in a sense, but you have to take into account that the shift from Catholicism to Protestantism and changing religious attitudes are also influenced by structural changes. So it is a kind of chicken and the egg question. But I think a big thing that undermined the Tories was that it was the problem is that the society that they were defending lacked stability because it itself was born out of the rather revolutionary actions of Henry VIII. So to kind of briefly give my, I guess, thesis on this, my view is that actually it was the rise of the divine right of kings with the Tudors, and it was basically Henry VIII resorting to parliamentary authority in order to reinforce his own standing as an absolute monarch. So in the short term, that was great for the Tudors because they got to basically be these dictators, essentially, of modernizing rising states. But the problem is that they had to kind of co-opt parliament over and against the church and the aristocracy in such a way as basically gave Parliament an inflated ego. And so the idea that Parliament, it was rather unwise in the long term, because the idea that you could use Parliament with the Act of Supremacy, which is the act by which Henry declared himself as the head of the church, it's not really, I think, feasible to think that you could basically say that royal authority was so dependent on an act of Parliament and then expect that Parliament would not ultimately try to take that power to itself. So I kind of view basically Tories and Whigs as both wrestling over the kind of unitary psychology of sovereignty that evolved out of the Tudor period.
Well, I think another thing, too, to sort of lay the groundwork for how the English monarchy changed. Now, obviously, the English monarchy in its current iteration can more or less trace its lineage back to 1066 with William the Conqueror. But what's interesting is in an analogous situation to Hobbes's Leviathan defending the total state of Cromwell in order to bring unity to a divided nation. The rise of the Tudors has to be seen in light of the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses takes place at the end of the 100 Years' War, which is a fratricidal bloodbath between the two warring houses of York and Lancaster of the Plantagenets. And what ended up ultimately happening is all of this fratricidal conflict, which lasted 30 years, led to the more or less extinction of the Plantagenet line. And you have, I mean, it's hard for us to conceptualize 30 years of civil war, but it's really bad, even without modern weapons like machine guns and grenades. And we can sort of roughly imagine it using Afghanistan or Lebanon or Vietnam as a context, where they've been war-ridden for decades. So it would seem that this revolution in the divine right of kings was trying to solve the problem of disunity within England. And the War of the Roses wasn't the only one of its kind. On the middle of the 12th century, there was the anarchy between Stephen and Matilda. There was a lot of instability between the Plantagenets. And so when you have that, the temptation is to centralize power in the hands of one man, which is like, well, surely he can keep the state together. But as you pointed out, if your goal is to preserve the prerogatives of the monarchy, and the monarch then decides to give some power to another institution, like say Parliament, then the power of the monarchy is eventually undermined. And you know, as the Tudors failed to solve this problem, so did Cromwell. He also failed to solve this problem of a disordered England. One could argue that really it wasn't solved until Culloden in 1746, when the Jacobites are put down, by this time under the Hanoverian kings, under the post-Glorious Revolution settlement. But, I mean, I think we need to understand England was kind of a mess domestically. There were lots of insurrections, lots of civil wars, not just with the Irish and the Scots, but also between English. And this divine right of kings, which is associated with Toryism, was an attempt, I think arguably an unsuccessful attempt, to solve that problem.
Well, it is true. I'm sure that these ideas were given rise to by certain circumstantial realities. There's no denying that. But the truth is that power was not undivided, and so it was a kind of intellectual trick, where in order to deal with this, they were pretending as if sovereignty as this kind of abstract concept really was indivisible, when in fact the sort of phenomenon of anything that might be called sovereignty in reality was anything but indivisible. There was the Parliament and the king working in concert, and then earlier on, of course, you had the church. And so what happened was I think that they tried to sort of iron over that by basically, in a weird kind of way, claiming that the king and the Parliament were somehow synonymous bodies. And there's a technical term called the king and Parliament, which is a Blackstonian term. I believe it comes from him, which is basically meant to say to articulate the Whig position, which is that that the king, together with Parliament, can, in Blackstone's words, do anything not contrary to the laws of nature. But the problem is that they're basically just doing both. The Tories and the Whigs are operating under the delusion that sovereignty is indeed indivisible, and they're basically trying to explain how, okay, you had the king for a long time and you had the Parliament, but we're trying to say that sovereignty is indivisible. So what the Whigs do, or what the Tories do, is say, well, Parliament somehow is just an extension of the king, and so it's the king's decisions in practice that ultimately sort of dictate what is the law of the land. Whereas the Whigs say the same thing, right? Like the Parliament is kind of an extension of the like the sovereign will of the king, and it's all one unified body. But they just they both state things in the same language but have opposite meanings, and basically one just supports absolute monarchy, the other absolute parliamentary representative rule. And it does kind of come out of this weird project of trying to basically look at a situation where you have two legal entities and then claim that they're one.
Yeah. The now, when it comes to the Whigs, this is sort of how I see it. And would you agree that, well, certainly Thomas Hobbes himself was an authoritarian and therefore not a Whig. His idea of a social contractarian system is sort of like one of the key elements to the Whigs. And so, people like John Locke, with the Levelers, with John Lilburn, these people are very Whiggish, in that they have a social contractarian view of society, which is rooted in a kind of popular sovereignty.
What I would say about Hobbes is that you're right that he's not a Whig. What Hobbes is a methodological liberal.
Yes.
But yeah, I would say that that basically the liberalism, I think, is something that has to be understood partly aside from Whiggism, because liberalism is, I guess, more of an intellectual body of thought, or liberalism is more of an intellectual body of thought. And so that's kind of how Hobbes can get lumped in with people like Rousseau and Locke and Adam Smith and that whole intellectual tradition, because he's operating by their terms. Whereas with Whiggism, it's an actual political phenomenon, which is wrapped up in liberal philosophy, but they're two distinct things. So, Murray Rothbard, for example, is not really a descendant of the Whig tradition, but he is a descendant of the liberal tradition.
So how would you distinguish the Whigs from the liberals?
Well, I guess liberalism is, as like you said, it's basically liberalism is something that I think descends from scholasticism. So that basically, if you had Thomas Aquinas basically formulating things in terms of natural law thinking, and describes rights and obligations in a rather legalistic and mechanistic manner. Whereas then this is something that's later transmitted down through the Anglican divine Richard Hooker, who kind of puts a Protestant spin on it. And by the time it gets down to John Locke, it's used less to reinforce the idea of natural obligations and more individual rights, and the kind of understanding that there is a sort of a gentleman's agreement between the society, the people, and the rulers in the society. Now, I will grant that my terms may not be as clean as they might be, because then you could ask the question justly, well, where does that put someone like David Hume, for example, who did not have the same legalistic understanding, but was probably, in terms of his politics, more of a Tory in some respects. And so it does depend on how you define your terms. But the point is that Hobbes and Locke were joined in an intellectual tradition. We could argue to what extent Hume was part of that, or the Whig tradition, but they were involved in this development of natural rights, or contractual, you might say, politics explained as a kind of contractual arrangement, regardless of the extent to which they were in synchronization with the actual development of liberalism as it was expressed in the phenomenon of Whig politics.
Exactly. Now, a central feature of the Whig movement as a political ideological movement is what's often called the Whig interpretation of history, which, as far as I can tell, is the idea that with the application of human reason to problems, though primarily, though not exclusively, technological progress, we can continually go onward and upward to create a better, more just society with more liberty and freedom for all. And whereas the Tory reaction would have been, well, I mean, you can't reinvent the wheel. You can't start from scratch all over again. That reaction is sort of seen with Edmund Burke. Political philosophy is empirical, not a priori, in his response to the French Revolution. And then the Whigs would say, but look at all this progress we've made. We've expanded the rights of people. We've made a society more, more civilized. We're not as cruel as we used to be. We have more innovation. And to some extent, by tying their system to scientific and perceived moral progress, that was what gave the Whigs so much of an advantage. But ultimately, we're beginning to see now, with the rise of the populist right, which you and I have already covered in your Parthenon series, that a lot of these promises about a technological, rational society are not quite what they were cracked up to be. Is that more or less correct?
Well, the Whig interpretation of history in terms of defining it is rather complicated, because in defense of the Whigs, the Whig historiographers, they have basically been the punching bag of academia for the last 100 years. And I always get frustrated when I hear historians, mostly left historians, open articles or lectures or what have you by saying, now we're all kind of hoodwinked by this Whig interpretation of history, and we have to be more nuanced and get on with that. Well, the Whig interpretation of history has been systematically purged from academia for over 100 years now, or maybe not over, but basically a century. And these people still open up their articles by basically acting as if they're doing something clever by dispelling the Whig interpretation of history. And so, obviously, in the hands of such people, the definition of what that is not going to be entirely clear. Now, it does have roots that go back to the actual Whig phenomenon of politics, in that there was a group of people in the Victorian era who, broadly speaking, had classical liberal or pro-parliamentary politics, but which were but which are decidedly not the extent of the people who are being attacked in academia as Whigs now. So basically, from that particular epoch in historiography, the anti-Whigs in academia are basically going after anyone who does believe in any kind of inexorable progress, or any kind of teleological view of history, or really any kind of Hegelian understanding of history where there is an evolution towards something, or there is any kind of, you might say, superiority of Western civilization as it's developed out of more primitive existences that are still found in other societies. And so it is a kind of politically correct condemnation of the Whig interpretation of history, which is not necessarily anti-classical liberal. It's just anti-teleological. So I think that the term Whig understanding of history has basically come to mean any kind of pro-Western, pro-modern teleological view of history. Now, this is additionally disgraceful when you take into account that the most striking example of a Hegelian interpretation of history is Marxism. But that is still allowed in university history departments, even though methodologically speaking, it commits every single one of the errors of which they accuse the Whig historiographers. So basically, my definition of the Whig interpretation of history, as defined by my irritants, is that basically it is non-Marxist Hegelian historiography.
All right. Now, I suppose there's also a Tory and Whig in the United States have a somewhat different meaning than in England. So the loyalists to the British Crown and the Revolution were called Tories. And between the American Revolution and the Civil War, there was the Whig Party. So maybe you could break down some of those distinctions.
Right. So in the American Revolution, I think it was mostly rhetorical because the American revolutionaries were trying to cash in on the rhetoric from the Glorious Revolution. They called the patriots Whigs, and they called the loyalists Tories, which is kind of laughable because the Tories were not even in power in England at the time. Basically, the George III was a solidly Whig king, and in fact, the Hanover dynasty had basically had basically kind of pushed the Tory remnant into Rod Dreher levels of significance. And I think that that the most ironic part is that the Whig hegemony in England was actually behind a lot of the grievances that the Americans were complaining about, because like the Supremacy Act, not the one, maybe it wasn't called the Supremacy Act, that, but there was an act that was basically said that the British Parliament could legislate on any and all matters in the English colonies, which would become the United States. And this is something that was justified on the grounds of parliamentary sovereignty, which is basically the Blackstonian Whig model of government. Now, the Americans, equally ironically, were basically I
think we lost you there, right? Ruminations. Well, it looks like we lost Right Ruminations. So the other group, the Whigs, in the context of the between the Revolution and the Civil War, have to do with the Libertarians' mortal enemies, the Whig Party, which was guilty of economic nationalism. The people like Hamilton, he was a Federalist, but in a way he was a proto-Whig. And then, of course, Abraham Lincoln, who some consummated the Whig ideology with his economic nationalism of the Republican Party. And one of the things with that is, they thought that the capitalist system, infant American markets would not be able to compete with developed European markets unless they were protected. And then they could then grow up in the shadow of this protection, which would allow them to eventually compete with the European economic forces. And Henry Clay, of course, is sort of the main guy behind this. Now, one can point to relatively poor investments like the Erie Canal. You're back.
Yes, so sorry about that. I think StreamYard and my computer are in a conflict with one another. But so I was saying that certain, by that I mean the American patriots, they wanted to restore certain Tory legal institutions, like the veto. Like they wanted George III to step in and veto certain acts of Parliament. Well, that had not been done for a half a century, since the time of Queen Anne, who was a Tory. Likewise, they wanted the individual colonial legislatures to be sovereign and have legislative power that the British Parliament wouldn't in their own areas. So there is this kind of irony where basically the Americans are arguing against parliamentary sovereignty in favor of this kind of Edward Coke older legal idea from the sort of maybe like the late Tudor, maybe early Hanoverian dynasties, or late Stuart, early Hanoverian dynasties, of having some kind of divided powers and some kind of reserved prerogatives of the king, whereas it's actually the British who are arguing for the full interpretation of the Blackstonian post-Glorious Revolution model. So there's this irony where there were these kind of agreed on terms for symbolic reasons, that the revolutionaries were the Whigs and the loyalists were the Tories, when in fact, if anything, it would be the other way around, because it was actually the revolutionaries who were arguing for the restoration of some checks against Parliament. But in reality, of course, it was nonsense. These were two brands of liberalism fighting against one another.
Now, before you cut out, I don't know how much of what I said you heard, but the other usage in Whigs in U.S. history is the Whig Party between the American Revolution, or more specifically after the collapse of the Federalist Party, and I think around 1815, and right up until the collapse of the Whig Party in the 1850s, leading to the creation of the Republican Party. And the Whigs are sort of the bad guys of libertarian historiography because of their economic nationalism policies. So even though he wasn't a Whig, Hamilton is kind of a proto-Whig. John Clay is the classic Whig economic nationalist, and then we see Abraham Lincoln with the Republican Party. And again, in other discussions we've had with the paleocons, it's really weird. They tend to be free market advocates, but then Whiggish because they're in favor of American nationalism. Or rather, it's flipped around. People like Pat Buchanan are in favor of American nationalism and are very Whiggish, but then also tend to support the Confederacy culturally during the Civil War. So there is this confusion here with the paleocons. The libertarians are just consistently against the Whigs, full stop. Now, without opening the can of worms about economic nationalism again, would you say that's largely correct?
Yes, I would say that that's largely correct in terms of the inconsistency in the paleocons. Now, in terms of Whiggism in the United States, obviously these are party terms of convenience, so they're rather ontologically distinct from how these things appear in England. But a way of simplifying what the Whig Party was in the United States is that when Andrew Jackson became president, he ended up making a large number of people unhappy in both factions, both in the kind of Jeffersonian South and in the Hamiltonian North. And the reason he made the Northerners unhappy was because he stood for states' rights, at least ostensibly. He was in favor of free trade, once again, at least ostensibly. But at the same time, because he was so poor in carrying through on these things, like he signed something called the Force Bill, which would basically shut down the idea of state nullification and enable the federal government to use the army against individual states. He passed, under his watch, something was passed largely with the help of Northern Democrats, something called that was called in a pejorative term the Tariff of Abominations, which was a tariff much larger than I think anything that would be tolerated today, for example. And this, of course, made people in the South, like John C. Calhoun, unhappy. And so what a Whig meant in American terms is anti-Jackson. So on the one hand, yes, you did have people like Henry Clay or Webster who were Whigs in the more conventional sense because they thought he was a threat to their nationalist agenda. On the other hand, Calhoun at one point contemplated becoming a Whig. He may have actually become one at some point. Likewise, John Taylor, who was probably the most pro-Southern, kind of like proto-Confederate president in U.S. history, who actually went on to be a congressman in the Confederate Congress. He himself belonged to the Whig Party precisely because it really was kind of amazingly ecumenical for a political party, in that it really was a party of people who hated Andrew Jackson. And the reason they called it Whig was to say he's behaving like a monarch. He's behaving like an absolute monarch, so we are analogous to the parliamentary dissidents in the English context. And to touch on what you had said in a little more depth about the paleoconservatives, yes, there is this contradiction with a lot of them where they kind of support like the vibe of the Southern faction, like traditional families, local government, things of that nature. But at the same time, they're still anti-war, protectionist, and also pro-Catholic. So there is this kind of thing where the South was actually an imperialist, free trade, like you said, imperialist free trading slaveocracy, which doesn't really institutionally have that much in common with a lot of what the paleoconservatives support. But I think that basically the paleoconservatives just support things that are old, and so compared to, if you're looking back to say the 1920s, then yes, tariffs and subsidies of certain kinds, and like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, that's old-fashioned, but so is the South and the Confederacy. So I think the paleocons just don't differentiate between the different eras of old things that they're nostalgic for, so it kind of gets jumbled together.
Yeah, and so it looks like what you're saying here, especially in the United States context, Tory and Whig, is really more rhetorical, detached from the direct English context in a way to earn brownie points with your constituency.
Yes, I think in terms of actual of actually being intellectual descendants of the classical liberal tradition, it was actually the Democrats in the South who would be more closer to Whigs in that sense of being actual legitimate classical liberal dissidents. Whereas the Whigs politically supported very centralized managerial government. Now, ironically, without trying to confuse this too much, it may have been a rather fitting mistake because, of course, the actual Whigs in the British Parliament after the Glorious Revolution did themselves end up tending towards high tariffs and centralization and bureaucratization and things of that nature. So, when different people calling themselves Whigs in the name of some ostensible classical liberalism all end up committing the same lies of convenience, they often end up looking rather analogous to one another by accident.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also this sort of strange hybrid called Red Toryism, if you might want to explain that a little bit.
Yes, so Red Toryism, I think, is more of a byproduct of the Benjamin Disraeli era of conservatism, where where Whiggism had already been around long enough that it had become associated with the new liberal merchant elite, as it were, the bourgeoisie. And so the Tories kind of tried to leapfrog the industrial hierarchies inherent in classical liberalism by reaching out to the labor socialists. And so this kind of quaint sympathy for noblesse oblige was paired with cooperation with certain populist elements. And this is something that was always, to an extent, inherent in Toryism, kind of inevitably, because, of course, if you're trying to harken back to a more primitive elite, you're going to want to side with the underdogs of the rising elite. So in a sense, it was inevitable that Toryism on the way out would adopt certain populist tendencies. But this was intensified, I think, under Disraeli, who I believe was the prime minister who introduced, was it called the House Bill or something like that, which basically said that anybody who owned a house could vote. And this was part of this kind of populist outreach. Whereas with Red Toryism and High Toryism, these are kind of like the more modern, like Rod Dreher, Roger Scruton, Peter Hitchens kind of taking that to the next level in the name of high church theological views.
Now one group in English history that is often pigeonholed as Whig, which I don't really think fits the Whig mold, but usually is pigeonholed because it opposed Toryism, is the Puritan ideological movement in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, obviously, Charles I and the Cavaliers were the arch Tories. They're about as Tory as you can get. And because Cromwell opposed the Tories, he's perceived to be a Whig. Now, from your definition of Whiggishness, it's a sort of non-Marxist Hegelian history. It's based on, on human reason, solving problems. Maybe not a complete rejection of tradition. It's not, revolutionary Marxism or French Jacobinism, but it does view it as less serious of a foundation. And then also, both the Whigs and the Tories were arguing that king and parliament, were essentially the same, even though they were two separate institutions. Sovereignty rested in them. The Puritans claimed sovereignty rested in God. They tended to prefer representative forms of congregationalism. Obviously, Cromwell was a military dictator. Even Winston Churchill, not a fan of Cromwell, the arch Tory Churchill, writes that in the English history of the English-speaking peoples, that even he has to admit part of the reason why Cromwell didn't develop a representative form of government was because England was so divided, only an army could keep it together. That's sort of a backhanded compliment after he rakes Cromwell over the coals for a whole bunch of other issues. So, but I think they don't really, whatever you want to think about the Puritan experiment, it doesn't really fit into the Whig category. You can only fit it into the Whig category because it's opposed to Tories. Sovereignty is in God, not in Parliament, not the king. And they tended to have, again, like the Tories, they would have been skeptical of human reason to solve problems. They would have been in favor of embracing a certain kind of tradition, maybe not the same as the Tory tradition, but a certain kind of tradition derived from Scripture. But also, like the Whigs, they would have been concerned about social improvement. So, for example, not at all anything like animal rights. Most history of animal welfare would originate the first rational concern for animal well-being with the Puritans in England and the United States. And it's usually some sort of derivative of the sundry laws of Moses. So there are elements in which the Puritans are like the Whigs, the forms of maybe like social progress and the sort of forward-looking attitude. They tend to be post-millennial. But then also there's elements of them like the Tories in the sense that they're skeptical of human reason. Reformed theology is, well known for its view of the noetic effects of sin on human reason, as well as their desire to hold to a sort of biblical fundamentalism. And again, sovereignty is, in their concept of reality, undivided in God, not the king or the parliament. So I would say, well, they're often lumped in with Whigs. It's really inappropriate, and they only have a superficial resemblance at best.
Well, this is an interesting question and a fairly complicated one. I think that, first of all, with respect to the question of them thinking that sovereignty was something that was located in God and then imparted to his subjects, is, I think, not entirely fair, because that is the language that everyone used, right? So, for example, even when you have American founding fathers like John Taylor of Caroline, right? He would say that, well, yes, the states are sovereign, but ultimately it's not the states, it's the people. And then even then, it's not the people, it's God. So I think that, in a sense, this is something that all of the parties in question would acknowledge. But something that has to be remembered about the Puritans in Cromwell's time is that they actually date, though they predate, the rise of the Whigs in terms of as they came to exist in the glorious conflict of the Glorious Revolution. Now, in favor of the side who would say that these were part of the Whig current in history or were proto-Whig, is that they were on the side of Parliament, that they were part of the parliamentary side initially. I'm not necessarily saying Cromwell, but I'm saying that the initial movers who ultimately led to Cromwell being in charge, many of whom did not end up liking Cromwell very much, were themselves essentially shown to be parliamentary absolutists. Because you have to remember that Charles I, by assenting to the Petition of Right, which would basically settle on a kind of divided powers model, had already made the concessions that the earlier Parliament had requested of him. And essentially, their position was that he was not fit to hold office, and that basically Parliament was meant to take on many of the powers which Charles viewed as part of the monarchy. So I think that it is just to put the parliamentary side in the English Civil War as being part of the, at least prototypical of the Whig development, precisely because it is really what started this idea of parliamentary sovereignty rolling along. Now, I will say, of course, that Cromwell, because history is messy, is a different story, because he ultimately would completely repudiate a number of those kind of parliamentarian grounds on which the cause was fought, by then basically, as you said, erecting himself as a military dictator. And in that case, he had every bit as much as power as Charles I did. So they were not necessarily a shining example of what a Whig, politically speaking, would want to see, but they were part of that trend. Now, with respect to your objection about them not fitting the Whig interpretation of history, I would agree in a sense that's not the model that they were philosophically attached to, but that's why it's important to separate the Whig interpretation of history from Whiggism as a political phenomenon, because the Whig interpretation of history didn't really exist until Blackstone, and then it didn't really exist until the Victorian period. So I think that as historiographers, the Puritans were not Whigs. Institutionally, they were not Whigs because they did not exist at the time of the English of that particular struggle. But I do believe that in the outplay of history, that they were on the Whig side, as it were.
Well, the probably a better example to compare what a actual Puritan society would look like, because in England they had to coexist or not, as it turns out, with already existing power structures. In New England, there really weren't any already existing power structures to compete with. So in that regard, we might get a more pure expression of a Puritan political system. And even the late anarchist Murray Bookchin, in one of his final interviews, I think it was around 2002, and again, he's a bit of a black sheep with anarchists, because unlike most, he actually uses historical examples to make his case. He's famous for saying that Puritan New England, with the congregationalism and town hall meetings, and ancient classical Athens were prototypical for his idea of a democratic anarchist federation. Got him into a lot of trouble. But it's kind of where it gets messy, because are the Puritans proto-left anarchists? Because Bookchin tries to claim them. Are they Whiggish? Because on the one hand, the Whigs as a political movement are associated with the rise of capital and consumerism and private power, whereas not just in the sort of rhetorical sense are Puritans known as killjoys. Cromwell took active measures, as did the Puritans in New England, to limit commercial activity in a way that most Whigs would have found obnoxious. And so, again, I think it would be best to interpret the Puritans, which again are more of a flash in the pan per se, as a third stream alongside Tories and Whigs.
Well, I think that the way I would look at this is that if you try to define Puritanism, which is something I won't do, I'm sure that Whig politics will have nothing to do with the definition of Puritanism per se, right? There's no reason that under a certain configuration you couldn't, say, have a communist Puritan or an anarchist Puritan. These are political systems that are going to be influenced by a puritanical presence and may have to work in and around a puritanical presence, but are not essential to the definition of Puritanism. But I would not go so far as to say it's a third thing. What I would say is that Puritanism is an inextricable element in the development of British liberalism, even though the two are not in any way essentially defined by one another. They have an inextricable influence on one another, and insofar as the Puritans do have a placement with regard to Whiggism and Toryism, they're decidedly more they decidedly err more in the direction of the Whigs than of the Tories. That's what I would say.
Okay. One of the things, I guess, now is just my sort of thoughts on the Whigs and the Tories. I don't find myself easily fitting into either category. So, for example, I would agree with the Tories that traditional norms and values, such as the church, such as traditional family norms, and other things, are ultimately desirable and should be protected. I don't think an absolute state is the solution to the problem of, the War of the Roses or the anarchy. I think that, well, in fact, as they learned at the hands of Oliver Cromwell, the absolute state can easily be used against you. And they were very sore about that. So, you got to be careful what you ask for. You might get it. I would not easily fit in the Whig camp either, because I don't really believe human reason in any autonomous sense can really solve these problems that beset society. I would probably share some of their concern for social improvement to mitigate the more authoritarian or violent impulses of ancient peoples. But again, like I said, I would say that I don't believe I fit easily into either category. But I think it might be interesting to hear what you think about my being fitting in those two categories.
Well, what I would say is that, first of all, you have to remember, with things that today would be considered traditional mores, in terms of traditional family structures of the church, those are things that were equally supported by the Whigs and Tories. So, both of them would be impossibly conservative on those issues compared with the average person today, or even people who would be considered far right today. Furthermore, I think in terms of religious liberty, although neither had terribly good records on religious liberty, largely because it didn't exist at that point in time, the Whigs certainly, at least with respect to Protestants, were more erring on the side of support for religious liberty. What I would say, another thing that's important to remember is that both of them were basically in support of an absolute state. Because it doesn't really matter whether that absolute state comes under the parliament or under the king. It's still an absolute state if you really believe that sovereignty is indivisible. What I would say is that there is a strand that is kind of playing between the two, that was basically is present in Edward Coke, the jurist under James I, who basically wanted something like the American system, and tried at least to tie that back to feudal law. And he believed that the common law actually bound the king and parliament. So you would have, say, the right to bear arms, or you would have the right to trial by jury. And these were not simply parliamentarian restrictions against the king. These were to be enforced against both, and the king and parliament and the court were meant to basically correct for one another. And this is one of the reasons that the American founding fathers were largely fans of Edward Coke rather than William Blackstone. You also find this kind of thinking in some of the more moderate elements in both the Royalists and the Parliament during the English Civil War. And there's a whole group of people associated with names like John Hyde and Edward Culpeper, who basically believed, yes, Charles I did overstep his bounds, but Parliament is also overstepping its bounds. Just like the American revolutionaries, they wanted a kind of balance between the king and the British Parliament, and then later they'd go on to support a system of checks and balances in the actual formation of the American Republic. What I'm getting at with this is that I think that in a kind of, as you might say, esoteric way, there was a sort of third alternative, which might be called like moderate liberalism or something like that, which grew up between Whiggism and Toryism, which was about legalism and divided powers. I would imagine your political sympathies would probably be more in line with that group. I know that mine certainly are.
I think that's probably a fair assessment. And anybody who's listened to my discussions with Keith Preston and anybody about political theory, I do tend to favor a more mixed constitution with checks and balances, without necessarily giving any one institution or group, the killing strike on the other.
Yes, I think that that's really one thing that, in a sense, makes at least the early American Republic a kind of vindication of some ideas in the English tradition, which never really got their full day in the sun with any longevity in English history. Maybe you might say in the later days of Charles I, or maybe after, like maybe during the reign of Charles II. You might have had something like that, or maybe at the time of Queen Anne, right after the Glorious Revolution. But by and large, there was this kind of this sort of legalistic tradition, which I think was really given was kind of given flesh, as it were, in the American Revolution, where they actually did kind of do what I think Koch was hinting at, and actually write down the law in a way that implied that it was a fixed entity that existed independently of the observer and was not simply the arbitrary reflection of a particular political body, be it king or parliament.
Mm-hmm. We're nearing about the end of the hour, so is there any final statements you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I think that Tories and Whigs are often misunderstood because they make catchy labels for rhetorical purposes, and so when you put the American revolutionaries rhetoric of Whigs and Tories, which was totally backward, together with conflating Whig with classical liberalism, classical liberal, which doesn't always mean the same thing, together with the using it as a term, Whig as a term of abuse when people talk about the Whig school of history. I think it's important to realize that essentially Tories and Whigs represented impulses in the history of English political development in the modern era, which was basically resolving the fact that you had two competing political bodies, court and parliament, and that these were both trying to operate within the framework that had been created by Henry VIII's Act of Supremacy, which basically declared a unitary sovereign entity. And so that's the primary reason that these terms are of interest, is because that they are labels of convenience for the outplay of these political realities in light of that meta framework.
All right. Thanks again, Right Ruminations. It's always a pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Todd.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.